Okay.
Okay. And we're live, and this is Claire Core talking to Dale B. Martin of Yale, a retired professor on New Testament scholarship. Is that right, Dale?
Yes, basically biblical scholarship, New Testament studies, and history of ancient Christianity are my specialties.
So you would know all about certainly more than most of us, on the provenance of the New Testament and the Pauline epistles and Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and when they
Yes,
were written and that kind of thing.
yes, that's what I taught for about 40 or so years.
Right. I don't know if you've heard of a book called Caesar's Messiah, written by Joseph Atwill. Have you heard of that one?
No, I've not seen that book.
Right. Oh, I almost wish I had mentioned it to you, because I had him on my channel over Christmas, and he's basically the one who said that the New Testament was written by the Roman propaganda department, and he used a technical term called, oh, and I can't even remember what it was called now, but he was saying something that reflects us. Well, he was saying that the New Testament repeated certain patterns in the Old Testament to give a suggestion of, fulfilling a prophecy or words to that effect. And he said that basically it was a Roman propaganda department who, in order to punish the Jews for their rebellion and costing the Romans so much blood and treasure, a way of making their Messiah serve Roman purposes, and therefore making him, one that submits to punishment, gets crucified, isn't too scary, is able to, make suggest to people that if they are meek and submit, they will inherit the earth, and and not to rebel against the Romans. I think that's what I can remember from my understanding of it.
Well, that's a most bizarre theory, although I'm never surprised about conspiracy theories from the ancient world or the modern world. It is not true, I believe, that Joe Biden, the president of the United States, is controlled by a Martian implant in his brain. And just the same, it's actually it's more complex to try to find the historical data to support these conspiracy theories than it is just to take the data for what it looks like to a historian. The Romans didn't care about Jesus, except that on one day in Jerusalem, he was crucified because other people, mainly upper class Jews, the Sadducees, who were the priests who controlled the temple, and maybe some Pharisees, but they just decided that he was a rabble rouser, and people were, I don't know that Jesus of Nazareth claimed to be the Christ or the Messiah. He may not have. We don't know. We don't have good enough historical information. But he was definitely crucified under charges that he was claiming to the throne of Judea. He was claimed to be the king of Judea. That's why the Romans crucified him. But the Romans didn't really know anything about a movement of Christianity for, 100, 200 years after that.
But
People are
why would the
surprised.
Romans want to crucify him? I thought it was Caiaphas who said to the Romans, we can't crucify anyone. We can't even mete out the death penalty to anyone because you've taken over and you're the guys that can
That's right. That's
execute
right.
people. And Pilate said, no, we don't do this sort of thing. What's this blasphemy thing? It's not us. It's not Roman.
Well, for one thing, you cannot read the Gospels as being straightforward history, as being like a newspaper account. They're just not. All of the Gospels were written 40 to 70 years after the death of Jesus. They don't reflect the historical events of the death of Jesus. They reflect the beliefs of Christians 40 to 70 to 100 years after the death of Jesus. We just don't have, no Roman authority exists who even acknowledges the existence of Jesus until sometime in the 2nd century. That is the
Josephus.
200s or the 100s, you know.
Do you mean Josephus because he was a Roman high
Yes, he
Jewish
mentions
historian?
he mentions Jesus about twice, and he doesn't talk hardly anything about it. In fact, Josephus was writing around the year 96, or más o menos, toward the end. Now notice, if he's writing in the 90s, that again is 60 years after the execution of Jesus. Now, would you believe an account about the assassination of John F. Kennedy that used no historical sources until now? No, you would be skeptical. And that's what we historians try to teach, is that the Gospels are not reliable historiographical sources. Now, we can use them for reconstructing history. And I think that one of the things is there are some more skeptical historians. I hesitate to call them historians because I don't think they're trained professional historians, meaning they don't have a PhD from a legitimate university in historiographical work. But sometimes they'll exist. Jesus never existed at all. He was a complete fabrication of the later church. Well, that's just not reasonable. And the reason it's not reasonable is because we have 4 separate Gospels in our New Testament.
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, exactly. Mark is the earliest, almost undoubtedly written around the year 70. Matthew and Luke used Mark as sources, so they copy Mark a lot, but they also change him a lot. Matthew and Luke don't present the same Jesus as Mark does, nor do they present the death of Jesus the way Mark does. And then the Gospel of John was written probably around the year 90 or 100 or 110. And then the letters of Paul are the earliest Christian writings we have. And Paul wrote only 7 letters that are in the New Testament that claim to be by Paul were actually written by Paul. Most of them were written by disciples of Paul and followers of Paul many years later. But if you just take the 7 letters of Paul, they're probably written around the year 50. And that's the earliest written material we have about anything about Jesus. 50. And that's 20 years after 30.
Well, it wouldn't be acceptable in a court of law as testimony, which is what Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were all about.
No, of course it wouldn't. They tried to present what they were writing as like legally verifiable testimony. But that's just not true. Historians just can't believe that. This is not unique to Christianity. I mean, Judaism, for example, looks to Moses as the great prophet and the writer of the Torah, the Jewish scripture and law. No good scholar believes that any account of the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the first 5 books of the Jewish Bible, no historian believes that those take us back to Moses. They may have been written in around the 500s, which would be half a millennium after the existence of Moses. So the idea that Christianity took 100 to 200 years to develop shouldn't be surprising to anybody. It's just people kind of they get all in a fit, and they act like we historians are being hypercritical when we say, well, the Romans killed Jesus, and they probably killed him on a charge of insurrection and being a claim to the throne. But that doesn't prove that Jesus ever did claim to be the Messiah. or that he did claim the throne. And the writings that try to make this case out to be more firm all come from years and years after Jesus' death. And it's, of course, because Christianity by that time had become a movement that was recognizable. But, people are sometimes surprised that the first time we have Romans actually persecuting Christians as a legal mechanism in the universal Roman Empire is 250. Under the persecution of Decius, the Emperor Decius. 250 years after the supposed birth of Jesus. We don't know when Jesus was born, but if you place the birth of Jesus in the year 1, then the first time the Romans really take any notice of Christianity in a methodical way is 250.
How were they causing problems for the Romans, these Christians?
Well, they weren't, for the most part. The earliest, now Jesus, yes, was probably causing problems. I have argued in a couple of essays that Jesus went to Jerusalem in the last few days of his life. He spent most of his time in Galilee, which is where he was from. He was born in Nazareth and grew up in Capernaum, both small villages in Galilee, which is the northern area of what we now call Israel.
He was born in Bethlehem.
No, that's what Matthew and Luke say, but they're saying it because they want him to be the Messiah. And there were some Jewish...
The Messiah was supposed to be born in Bethlehem, was he?
Well, that's what some prophecies in the Hebrew Bible said, that he would be from the house of David. He would be a descendant from King David. And remember, David lived around the year, 1000 BCE? So, how do we trust that these sources are correctly reflecting that Jesus's family? Also notice that Matthew and Luke put Jesus' family in Bethlehem by two completely different methods. According to the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus' family is simply from Bethlehem. That's Mary's hometown. Right. So, of course, she gets pregnant and she gives birth to Jesus there. According to Luke, Mary's hometown is in Nazareth, in Galilee.
Right.
And Mary and Joseph go to Bethlehem in order to register for a census. Well, that's just pure historical fiction. There were no censuses in the Roman Empire which said that people had to go to the home of their ancestors of 1,000 years ago. I don't know about you. Maybe you're in a different cultural situation. But if someone came to me and said, you have to go back to where your ancestors were 1,000 years ago.
Right.
Where would I go? I wouldn't even know.
No.
I think they came from Scotland and England, but I've lived in Texas most of my life. So these are religious fictions, yes, and mythologies and legends. And that's all fine. I want to stress, I'm not saying this to disparage Christian faith. I just believe that Christian faith has to be based on something different from the critical study of history and historiography. But from a historiographical position, Jesus was born in Nazareth, probably raised there, maybe traveled with, he developed a few disciples. He preached about the end of the world and the kingdom of God. And he preached about some Messiah character coming to rule the world and overthrow the Romans. So there was messages about Jesus that the Romans could have heard about. But the real problem was Jesus went to Jerusalem right at the end of his life. And then there were Jews, most probably, not the Romans, who got excited about him proclaiming himself to be the Messiah. But he couldn't be the Messiah. He wasn't rich. He didn't ride a big horse. He didn't have a big sword. All the expectations they had of Messiah were contradicted by this poor, self-proclaimed prophet from Galilee.
Yes, and apparently the Messiah was supposed to have a summer birthday. He was supposed to be born on Tisha B'Av, which is their time, a time of commemoration of why Jews suffer and why terrible things happen to them, and that's also part of the Jewish well, part of the Jewish series of, things that they have to commemorate throughout the year. And also, before I forget, I wanted to say that Jews say, well, we have no record of Jesus in our Talmud. Just absolutely nothing. I mean, the best thing we could find was somebody called Jesus who was stoned to death for blasphemy, and then they named a few apostles, and Mattei is the only one that sounded like he could be one of the apostles, and the others had different weird names, and the penalty for blasphemy is stoning to death, and that's all the references that Jews have in their Talmud of him, of Jesus.
There's a little bit more than that, but you're right, there's not much. But remember, there are two Talmuds. There's the Palestinian Talmud and there's the Babylonian Talmud. And the Palestinian Talmud, most scholars would say, came from around the year 200. So again, we're talking 200 years after the birth of Jesus. Mm-hmm. The Babylonian Talmud was created and codified around the year 400. And so when you use Talmudic references to try to reconstruct the historical Jesus, it's just not reliable historiography. I mean, who would use, a newspaper from today to establish what is historical about Washington, President Washington? Legends develop. We know that a story circulated not long after Washington's death that, he chopped down the cherry tree in his yard.
Yes.
And, son said, his father said, did you chop down the cherry tree? And he
Sir,
said,
I cannot tell a lie.
I cannot tell a lie. Yes, well, that's complete fabrication. We know because we even know the name of the preacher who invented the story for a sermon in church. So this is what historians...
It's possible that it's true. I mean, isn't it possible that the little boy George might have said that?
Anything's possible.
I suppose he couldn't have... how old was he?
Well, according to the legend, he was like 12 years old. But like I'm saying, it was all invented decades later by a preacher, a Christian preacher, who was trying to invent a story about honesty. We can do this tons and tons of times. We can kind of reconstruct what we think might have actually been the case historically from a historical critical perspective about the birth of Jesus, about Jesus' relationship to John the Baptist. This is one thing that Josephus comes in handy for. Josephus spends a whole lot more.
They were cousins, weren't they? I mean, just for the benefit of anyone.
Only according to the Gospel of Luke. See, this is the thing. You can't take the Gospels about the birth and relationships of Jesus in his youth as being historical. They're just legends. And so, yes, according to the Gospel of Luke, Jesus was John's cousin. But that's almost entirely and completely false, because especially even the other Gospels, they admit that John the Baptist didn't know Jesus when he first met him. Now, how does he not know his cousin? He doesn't know his cousin because John the Baptist was a preacher in Judea of repentance and the coming kingdom of God. Jesus comes from Galilee, and I think this is historical, in order to be baptized by John the Baptist. Well, what does that mean? It proves that Jesus started out as a disciple of John the Baptist.
Yes.
And Peter and James and John and some of the most central disciples who later become called apostles, they also started out as disciples of John the Baptist. And that's why Matthew and Luke try to downplay the baptism. They say, oh, Jesus comes up to John and says, I want to be baptized with you. And John says, no, I can't. You're much superior to I am. I have to bow down and worship you. You're the Son of God and all this kind of stuff. And Jesus says, no, you have to baptize me. Well, that's a legend. And it's clearly invented by early Jesus followers to show that even though John the Baptist was the leader, and Jesus was the follower, Jesus was still superior.
And it was John who who was the sacrifice because he had his head, well, he was beheaded by Herod,
Yeah,
wasn't he?
according to the Gospels, yes.
Yeah, right. So,
I think I think there are other reasons John the Baptist was executed by Herod. Mainly, I think it's because he was preaching against Herod's marriage, and Herod had been divorced and then married his brother's wife.
oh, and there's something about doing that.
Yes, and so
Marriage to divorced wife's deceased wife's sister is biblically forbidden, something like that.
yes, but
I
also if
know it's
you
a theme from a Gilbert and Sullivan opera. Do you
yes,
remember that one?
no,
Iolanthe,
I
I
don't
think.
remember that scene exactly, but I love Gilbert and Sullivan.
It was
But
Iolanthe, I think.
okay, the here's where Josephus comes in handy. Josephus provides a lot more information about John the Baptist than he does about Jesus. So if you want to learn about John the Baptist, go to Josephus before you go to the Gospels. Although the Gospels can be used to supplement the information, but Josephus seems to think that John the Baptist was arrested and executed by Herod for very different reasons than what's depicted in the Gospels. And, John the Baptist was leading what was obviously a powerful kind of movement that was challenging the Romans only because it was saying I don't think John the Baptist ever raised an army. He never could have defeated the Romans. But what he was going around preaching was that God would come down with his Messiah, his anointed one, his king, who might be a human figure or might be an angelic figure, and that the Messiah and God would overthrow the Roman Empire and set up the new kingdom of Israel. That's what John was preaching, and that's why he got killed by the Romans. Not because of anything having to do with Jesus.
And John the Baptist would have had a problem with Herod because he was a Roman puppet, basically, wasn't he?
Yes, and he wasn't a very good Jew, according to conservative standards of the time.
Yeah, because of what's her name and her dance of the seven veils. And
Yeah, Salome is
Salome, yes.
yeah, the daughter of Herod's wife.
The unsuitable wife that everybody thought was no good.
Yes,
Probably because of her daughter, her salacious,
yes.
the salacious Salome. Right.
But now the thing is, my point is that you have to take all of these narratives from the Gospels or the Bible overall with a grain of salt. You cannot just claim that they're historical. If you have extra biblical material that you can go with, then that helps. But we don't have much about the early Jesus. So even with the Old Testament, you just can't take all the legends about David, for example, as being historically true. They're legends that develop over hundreds of years of time. And that's what we should expect as historians, because that's the way religions develop. I mean, nobody knows about the historical Buddha, for example. It's shrouded in mystery.
But don't the Jews regard their prophets as mortal and fallible? So they accept that Moses must have sinned. That was why he didn't get
Yes.
to the promised land, and David had designs on Bathsheba, and he wasn't completely a saint, shall we say? So. And I think this is a more healthy attitude to take towards one's prophets, and to assume that they could have done no wrong, and and talking about kings, isn't there a suggestion that even asking for a king was the Jews' kind of doing things in the Gentile way and following Gentile ways when actually they were perfectly happy in the times of judges when they were just these judges basically doing a circuit in the
Yeah.
way judges used to do to dispense justice, and they were happier then until they got their king.
And this is one of the most interesting ways of reading the Bible, is because in the Bible you have two different narratives in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible of why did Israel have kings. One of the narratives, which is probably the older one, is that they always resisted kings. We have no king but God, no God but Allah, no king but God. And so there's one tradition in the prophets of Israel that insists that we don't need a king. We don't want a king. And then there's a totally different tradition that comes from different sources in the ancient world, which say, no, we need a king. And so you have kind of the pro-David and the anti-David traditions, and they all get meshed up together in the Jewish Bible. And that's very valuable because it helps us see that things weren't clean and neat. But if you read critically, you can see, well, wait a minute, Samuel, the prophet who ended up anointing both the first king Saul and then the second king David, as if Saul was some kind of mistake, but Saul was supposed to have been chosen by God. Well, if Saul was chosen by God, why was he a mistake? Then why did you have to come up with David? Well, there's because there were Saul fans and there were David fans. And they each told their own stories. And that's why we have two different trends of stories. And when you go to graduate school, or if you go to a good seminary, and I mean by that, a seminary that teaches you how to read the Bible critically, not just completely gullibly. And they'll point out that, look, there are different sources in the Bible, and they're all edited together. A lot of this stuff was probably edited when the Jews were in the so-called Babylonian captivity, which was in the 6th century BCE. And that's when we think a lot of the 5 books of Moses, we think that a lot of that was edited together around then. But that's why you've got different traditions, if you learn how to read this critically. So some traditions believe that God never wanted to give the law to Moses in the first place. And Moses, under the pressure of the Israelites, Moses demanded that God give them a law. And then other traditions say, no, this was all God's idea from the beginning. And so you have the same kind of thing with the kings. Some traditions in the Hebrew Bible portray the development of kingship in Jerusalem as being God's divine providence and guidance. But there are others that say, no, God never wanted this, and the Israelites never wanted this. It was kind of put upon them by other people.
But can't we deduce from history, from Jewish history, that Jews didn't particularly do very well with kings, because their best king was Solomon, and after his death the kingdom split in two. So kings, not a good idea.
What are you going to do with a guy who had 1,000 wives? I mean,
his son was a no good Nick, wasn't he? But maybe if he hadn't so many wives, he might have been a better father to his no good
maybe
son.
You would think, but Absalom does not make a very good example of a good child. That's Solomon's son, who grew his hair out real long and he hanged himself in a tree.
Not the one who actually split the kingdom in two by upsetting everybody so much. I forget his name now. What was the name of?
Jehoiakim or?
Yes. It began with a J, and I could never.
Yeah, something like that. But there were 2 of them, and they split the kingdom into the north and the south. And then, of course, the kingdom of the north just disappears after several years. And according to the Bible, if you read it one way, it's because the northern Israelites were bad, and they started building temples to surrounding gods and gods of high places and started sacrificing. And that's why God calls the Assyrian Empire to come down and sweep away the northern Israel Empire and leave only Judea.
Oh.
Judea, the tribes of Judea and Benjamin are the only two that remain, and they're all in the southern part of Israel. So
So they were
yeah,
punished for their idolatry, the Northerners.
that's what some people would say. That's what the Bible presents it. Or see, again, that's what the Southerners said.
And you're Southerner, yes.
Yeah.
But isn't it interesting that even now we still have this attraction to kings? I mean, I talk to Americans who complain about their government, and then they say, "Ooh, wouldn't it be nice to have a king?" And I go, "Oh, but that's un-American. You can't say you want a king. You're an American," and they don't seem to care. But I see the American Revolution as a rejection of monarchy. And
Oh
it
yeah.
seems that Americans don't seem to remember or accept that. And
It definitely was. But even then, you had a great disagreement between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. John Adams, who was the vice president under George Washington, and then he was elected president after George Washington said he would serve no more than 2 terms. John Adams wanted people to call him His Excellency.
right.
And Thomas Jefferson totally rejected that because Thomas Jefferson was allergic to kingship and monarchy. And so Jefferson's, but that's also ironic because when Jefferson actually became president, after John Adams was president, Jefferson was more monarchical in many ways in his actual rule than John Adams was. Remember, Jefferson was the one who bought all of the Louisiana Purchase, which included, lands west of the Mississippi all the way up to Oregon and Washington. And he was the first one who sent Lewis and Clark to explore the West and to make sure it was all annexed for the U.S. and destroy all the Indians who lived there, if possible. So, you've got these conflicts throughout history. So it's not
surely
surprising.
the principle of the Republic was not that you couldn't have, titles for yourself, because that was what the Emperor Augustus did. I mean, he tried as first Emperor of Rome to kind of not be president. He'd say, "Oh, I'm not really, emperor, but maybe I am. I'm just first amongst equals." But don't.
Yeah, that's where you get the
don't
name
make a big
prince.
deal out of it.
We get the English word prince from the Latin princeps, which just means first. And Augustus was, well, to his credit, he was afraid of being knifed in the back by 30 different senators, as Julius Caesar was.
Yes.
And so Augustus played a great game. He's one of the greatest emperors. But you have to remember, Augustus was also not his name. That was a title.
Octavian.
Octavian was his name, yeah.
Yes.
And that just comes from the Roman word for 8. The Romans were terribly dilatory about naming their children. And so, they would call them, they only used a few names. So they would name him Primus, that means first.
Yes, number
Secundus.
1. Yes, kid number 1.
Secundus is second. Tertius is third. Quartus is fourth. The Romans were terrible about naming their sons. And so, Augustus's name was Octavian, which probably meant that he was just the 8th child of his mother.
Yes. I didn't know that. Well, it seems to me that we still have this tension of, veering between a republic and a king, because I think that there's something so seductive about having kings and queens, because they're people and families and, a kind of microcosm of perhaps a macrocosm of what we're used to as families, and I think because it's a stuff of fairy tales, people are reluctant to give up the story of once upon a time in a kingdom far away there lived a king and his queen and daughter, prince and princesses and that sort of thing, but it seems that history is pushing us into being a republic because when you think of Western history, you have the American Revolution rejecting monarchy, and then you had the French Revolution doing the same thing, and then the Russian Revolution. It's like, well, they don't really want kings because they tend to mess up, and for all sorts of obvious reasons, the pool of political talent in your country surely should be bigger than that of a single man's extended family, well, male relations.
Well, you're preaching to the choir here because I am very much anti-monarchical. I don't even like it when people, in America get so excited about the Queen of England. She's sick right now. She's 90 something years old. Oh, no, no, is she going to die? Wouldn't it be terrible if the Queen died? I just kind of go, oh, come on. She's the Queen of England. She's not, and I'm not a royalist. Let's just say
Well,
that.
I used to be sentimental about, the British monarchy, but now when I think of Britain, which is really only the 51st state of the USA, because the Americans are treating Prince Andrew as if he were a Californian or a Floridian, where the
I
age of
know.
consent is 18.
Yes. So I'm not a monarchist. I'm very much a Democrat in just about all senses of that term. But I realize the appeal to the other side because, nothing is messier than democracy. And just look at it right now. I mean, I live in Texas, for crying out loud. And Texas is a terrible democracy. It's run by a majority of people, but they're right-wing, gun-toting, racist and hatred-filled people to a great extent. And so, if that's what democracy means, you know, it might be good to have somebody, but also then I see how people adulate Vladimir Putin as, the great emperor of Russia right now. I don't like that either. So I am a Democrat, but it's that old saying, I can't remember who said it, but democracy is the worst system of government other than all the rest.
Well,
Um,
but in terms of human history, it didn't last very long in ancient Greece, and it didn't. And for Roman history, I think the imperial period of Rome lasted longer than the republican period of Rome.
oh, absolutely, absolutely. And I've written about this, and I've tried to point out how even the democracy of Athens, which is, one could argue that there were several different democracies around the ancient Mediterranean around and after the ascendancy of Athens, which happened in the 5th century BCE. So let's say, starting in the 400s, you have the Athenian democracy established by revolution. But then it was gone in 100 years. It didn't even last until the time of Alexander, really.
It
Alexander the Great.
destroyed both Sparta and Athens exhausted themselves in war, and Rome moved in rather in the same way that the Americans moved in on Europe after their two fratricidal wars.
That's right. That's right. The Romans took advantage of the lack of unity among the Greek-speaking peoples in the Eastern Mediterranean. That's exactly right. But the Romans didn't bring in democracy. We call it a republic because they did have votes, but the only people who were able to vote were men, non-slaves, free men, citizens of Rome, and they had to have a certain property qualification. They had to have a certain amount of income per year to vote. So, democracies have existed in very, very few times in human history.
But
I'm
democracy
still,
would only work if most voters were wise, and it's so clear they're not.
yeah, well, and I'm a Christian, and so I believe in the doctrine of original sin, uh, which helps explain a lot. You know,
When you say original sin, do you mean just human fallibility, or do you mean something
yes,
else?
we human beings are made to be fallible, and we prove it all the time. we make bad decisions. We trust our envy more than our love. We distrust our fellow human beings more than we trust them. And I'm not saying that people ought to believe in the doctrine of original sin. It's kind of a sticky, awful doctrine.
But surely Jews and Muslims also acknowledge themselves to be fallible. I think original sin means something a bit more. It was something that the Catholic Church used
Yes, I think,
to frighten parents into having their children baptized.
well, that's true in some historical periods, but I think in its best times, like with the writings of St. Augustine, who I think is one of the greatest, leaders of the church in all of history, even though he had his own problems. He wanted the Roman Empire to beat down the, heretics from the Visigoths and the Goths who were invading Rome. So Augustine was not a saint by any of our modern categories. But one of the things I think he got right was he said his idea was the doctrine of original sin simply makes sense of why we always make wrong decisions. Even sometimes when we're making right decisions, we don't make them sometimes for the right reason. Mm-hmm. And I just take that, I just kind of comfort myself in saying, well, my faith community has always said, okay, I'm going to use some questionable language and you can cut this out if you want to. But the way I've said it is that if we human beings can fuck it up, we will fuck it up. That's the doctrine of original sin.
Yes. But so we should take care to make wise decisions, and we may have a few clues about not repeating the mistakes of the past, and acknowledging that we do have an evil inclination, fueled by our ego to lower the status of others by telling lies about them, because that's the quickest way to raise our own status and lower that those of others, and I suppose it takes a form of bearing false witness against our neighbour, whom we might envy for his conveyance, his wife, his servants, or anything that is of his, because envy automatically incites hatred, and hatred will cause people to do bad things against you, and this is something I suppose we ought to acknowledge, and Christians have helpfully provided a list of 7 deadly sins that perhaps people now would, it would do well for people to be aware of what they are.
Yes, and that's what I think those are the best reasons to help the promotion, not of a imperialist religious system, but at the best parts of Christianity and Islam and Judaism. I mean, Christianity inherited from Judaism that the 2 most important commandments are love God and love your neighbor. And every other commandment is in there.
Well,
and I think
and obey his laws, and I suppose Jews have reduced it to 7 no-hide laws for Gentiles, and they've got 613 laws for themselves.
Yes, but the core of it was always, among the best rabbis, was always the dual commandment of love. But I take it also that that's exactly what Muhammad taught, that ethics, the treatment of other human beings in a good way, was always the most important aspect of his faith and his revelations. And so I just think that all of the major religions have been pretty good about trying to center down on the commandment of love.
But it's the Abrahamic religions that has
well, I don't think
most empire. I mean, the 3
yes,
global
that may be true, but Christian. I think that there's a long history in Buddhism also of the word that you find in Buddhism most often is not love so much as it is compassion. That is suffering with. and even to the extent of, many Buddhists being vegetarians because they wanted to suffer with, they wanted to have compassion for all animate life, animal life in itself. So I think it's something that binds together a lot of religious people if they are true to the roots.
But surely religion is not just about, our inner spirituality. It is unfortunately about law and war, and therefore the conduct of law and international relations. And I think the Quran actually has quite a few principles about how to treat prisoners of war and fighting only defensive wars and that sort of thing. I don't know if you read the Quran. Have you read it?
Yeah. Not very well, I have to admit. I find the Quran gets boring in places, but I read enough of it to know what are considered what I would say. Also, I've taught in religious studies departments for 40 years, and I've had fellow scholars who sometimes they were themselves Muslim and sometimes not, but they were experts on the Quran. And so I've had many conversations about the Quran with different scholars of Islam.
There is a White House Quran, is there not?
What?
There is a White House Quran which belonged to Thomas Jefferson, is there not?
Oh, I think, yeah, I actually don't know that for sure, but that sounds right. It sounds like something that Thomas Jefferson would have done. He took the Bible and he cut it up into pieces to keep out.
Yes, the Jefferson Bible. Don't you think he was trying to? What do you think that was about? What was the Jefferson? What's he trying to say?
Well, it was the Enlightenment. Jefferson is one of the foremost advocates of the modern Enlightenment, which is the idea that, and I don't believe this, but the idea that we human beings, if we just look for universal principles that we all share about goodness, about ethics, about the treatment of our fellow human beings, then we'll all end up with the same kind of sort of religion, which was basically more ethical religion than it was liturgical. Now, I actually am, an Episcopalian, and I go to church, and I actually do all the liturgies also, and I think those are important for me and for Christianity. But Thomas Jefferson didn't really want to have much to do with that. He just wanted to.
He was anti-Trinitarian. He was definitely.
Yes.
He hated the whole idea.
Which, why wouldn't he be? There's almost no doctrine of Christianity that is more unbelievable than the Trinity.
But that gives it a clue as to its rather dubious origins. And if we can agree that Christianity was the religion that Constantine used to prop up his failing empire, and he only adopted Christianity because he knew the imperial cult was failing, then we would know that Christianity was used to support the divine right of kings. And it failed when the American revolutionaries did their thing, and the French and the Russian revolutionaries.
You kind of made a very interesting move there, because you segued from the doctrine of the Trinity into the doctrine of the divine right of kings. One could just as easily say that the doctrine of the Trinity is inherently anti-monarchical, because there's not one ruler in the Trinity. There are three persons of the Trinity. It's more, if you want to say anything, it's got to be more like a committee of rule than, divine right of kings. Jesus is king, of course, but God the Father is over Jesus, and the Holy Spirit proceeds from God the Father and Jesus, and also enlivens the church and rules the world. So it's just interesting, you kind of made a movement from talking about the Trinity, which I would say is kind of inherently anti-monarchical. Monarch means one ruler, and the Trinity says there is one ruler, it's God, but that's God in three persons.
But I suppose being a little aware of what Christians used to do to each other, such as to burn heretics at the stake for denying the divinity of Jesus, which is another way of saying denying the Trinity, then you would see what it really was for. I mean, the whole idea of Christianity was to give rise to this idea that whatever is the religion of the absolute monarch, that would be the religion of his subjects. And if these subjects dared to question the Trinity, that would be heresy, for which the penalty would be death by burning. And the Americans rejected it after the terrible things that happened with the Salem witch trials and everything. Jefferson had the wisdom.
Now, come on, you are bouncing around. You're bouncing around from one incredible theory to another with no evidence.
Well, the evidence is the First Amendment.
Wait. The Salem witch trials were brought about because of the doctrine of the Trinity?
Well,
are you kidding me?
Well, what do you think it was about? I mean, obviously there was something wrong with Christianity for these Christians to be hysterically accusing each other of witchcraft.
Every human society has been hysterical. You're boiling things down to an ideal in your mind of what Christianity means. What I'm trying to show is that Christianity has not meant one thing ever. It's always meant lots of things. Just like Judaism has always meant lots of things, and Islam has always meant lots of things. You're just being antithetical to Christianity because you hate it.
Well, I've seen what it has done.
You haven't seen. No. You haven't
confused
seen.
And angry Westerners who now no longer can bring themselves to believe because of the First Amendment.
Every angry Westerner you want to bring up, I can haul out Francis of Assisi or Mother Teresa.
But the Westerners do not have a functioning moral system. They don't have a religion. They hate themselves. Christianity is a minority pursuit.
Where are you getting that
shit? It's a minority pursuit in the West. Hardly anyone I know is Christian.
You are just an ideologue. If you think that you can just make those statements about all Westerners and Western civilization,
but the overwhelming majority of Westerners that I know, and I've lived here for quite a while, do not believe that Jesus is God. They don't believe it.
Well, that's fine. Who would believe Jesus is God? It's kind of odd.
You're a Christian. I don't understand why you're now talking down your own Trinity.
I'm not. I'm saying I am a Christian, but I don't expect every Westerner to be a Christian. That's stupid. Stupid.
Then what do you expect them to be? Don't you think the morals of your political classes need to be regulated? They're currently unregulated. That's why everything is going wrong.
We were talking about Thomas Jefferson and the Enlightenment.
Yes, and the First Amendment came as a result of the Virginia Statute on Religious Freedom, which Jefferson drafted, and it must have been based on Chapter 2, verse 256 of the Quran, that says, "There is no compulsion in belief. Truth stands clear from error."
No, I don't think there's any evidence that it came from the Quran.
Well, there is such a verse if you look it up.
You can find a verse in the Quran for everything, just like you can find a verse in the Bible for everything.
We know that Jews have no freedom of belief.
I'm not gonna fight. I told you when we started this, if you wanted a discussion, that's fine, but you're just pressing fundamentalist Islamic ideas. You're a fundamentalist. So that means you don't care about reason. You don't care about ideas.
I'm happy to, hear your explanation of how you reconcile these contradictions.
Because there are contradictions in all of human activity and life.
But if we want a religion, we want a religion that's easy to believe, and Christianity is very difficult to believe, and that is why Nietzsche would say things as long ago as the 1870s that God is dead and we have killed him, and he must have meant that the belief in the Trinity is dead, and liberalism has killed it.
Okay, so now you're not only a fundamentalist, you're a conservative fundamentalist.
Well, these these historical facts lead me to my particular conclusions.
No, they don't. They don't. There is no such thing as historical facts that cause you to believe things. You interpret things that you read.
Yes.
You're an interpreter.
Yes,
and if you
and
deny,
so is everyone.
that's exactly right. All of us are interpreters. So you have to take the agency, the responsibility for your own agency in your interpretations. And you can't therefore say, oh, the facts just told me this. That's just not true. You are an
happy
interpreter.
to acknowledge that I interpret these events in the way that I have, and you disagree with me.
Yeah, but I also disagree with you because I think you're unethical in the way you're interpreting.
How am I being unethical?
It's hateful. You're being hateful.
Well, you hate me because of my interpretation.
I don't hate you.
Which questions.
I don't hate you at all.
The Trinity.
I don't hate you at all. I just wish that you were less hateful.
I haven't expressed any hatred for anyone.
Yes, you have. Yes, you have. You've tried to glom all of Western civilization on one particular theory about secularism, which is not true. You have tried to make me sound like that I'm countering my own faith because I admit that it's entirely reasonable for other people not to be Christians. I think it's entirely reasonable for other people not to be Christians.
Well, I don't disagree with you, and I'm saying there is a problem with if most Westerners don't have a functioning moral system, and it causes problems with their government who are doing crazy things that might start the Third World War, and I'm concerned because I live in the world.
Well, I think that your idea, in fact, this makes a lot of sense with your Islamicist worldview, is that you believe that somehow all of us humans should come together and agree on one system of values and knowledge. Well, I'm a pragmatist. I don't think that's ever going to happen.
Well, we can make a case for it.
No, you can do what you think is right for the sake of love. And I can do what I think is right for the sake of love. But that may indeed mean that you and I will never come to a complete agreement about a system. So you're talking about a system.
Yes,
that's
of course,
different than a principle.
We are talking about systems because we want.
It's
a mechanism to make things work and solve and avoid problems. And I think we are coming up to a lot of problems now, Americans and Europeans and the rest of the world.
Yes, that's true. But we're not going to get rid of the problems by hiring a committee to write a system that we all then swear to and live by.
Well, we already have holy books, and I'm saying that the most advanced version of monotheism is contained in the Quran.
Our holy books are all different. And I'm saying I can see value in all of the different systems, but that doesn't mean I want to set up one system, especially the Quran and Islamicism, as being the only valuable system for Western civilization. That, I think recent history has proven that, because Islamicists are causing most of the suffering politically created in the world right now.
Are they, or are they just victims of Western foreign policy?
They are part of Western foreign policy. Where do you think Islam came from?
I'm afraid I don't know what you mean.
Where did Muhammad live?
Mecca and Medina for a bit.
And where would modern contemporary governmental policies put Mecca and Medina now?
Saudi.
Yeah, Saudi Arabia. But they would not deny that Saudi Arabia is part of the West.
Well,
it's not
America
China.
Does have a global empire.
It's not China. It's not Japan. It's not Indonesia.
Well, I think all empires want.
Islam is a product of the West. If you want to create this thing, I don't like talking about the West as one entity. I think it's just dumb because the West is very complicated and involved. But if you cannot pick off Islam and put Islam in some pure state of existence that has no contact with what you're calling the West.
No, I don't. I don't do that at all. But I'm a little puzzled about why you say that Islam is a product of the West.
Because it came from the ancient Mediterranean.
Yeah. So you're
which
saying,
is where Greece came from, Rome came from, Egypt came from, Spain came from. They weren't all that separated.
well, I mean, you can say that the Middle East is where all the Abrahamic faiths come from, and obviously the West is a product of, belief in the Abrahamic God.
All right, thank you for making my argument for me.
Well, I wasn't disagreeing with you about that anyway. I'm just saying if there are, two competing
No, you
Gentile
were disagreeing.
religions, we
You
should
were
choose
disagreeing.
a better one. And
You
not,
were disagreeing. You were saying that Islam represents something as an alternative to the West.
no, the West will always be there. It's a geographical area, and whatever,
But
whatever.
come on, stop backtracking. I didn't introduce this talk about the West. You did. You were the one who first started talking about Western secularism and Western liberalism and all their faults and how you can't base civilization upon them. Well, I never said you could base civilization upon them.
Well, there is
I would
this.
it's just the way things are.
Well, I'm saying there is a problem, and it can be solved. And I'm saying that the problem is that the West doesn't have a functioning moral system, and you don't seem to care.
I don't think there's any possibility for you or anybody else to force your will on other human beings to construct a functioning system.
Of course, I can't force anyone to do anything they don't want.
Then why
All I can do
is forcing it?
is
Why
give
are you
arguments,
forcing it?
make arguments. All I'm doing is making arguments.
Well, then why don't you make arguments based on what's good and bad in particular cases? But you can't make a functional argument based on facts and science for the need for us to come up with a committee.
Well, a committee is basically, well, part and
But what do you
parcel of
expect? Now,
government
what do you expect?
departments.
No. Come on. What do you expect? Walk me down this line. You have some kind of vision for what, I don't know, rational system of self-government to be. Where do you think that's going to happen?
Well, hopefully it will come from America when Americans finally come to terms with their history of being the exceptional and indispensable nation for acknowledging their Islamic roots. That's what the White House Quran was all about. That was what Jefferson was talking about.
That's
The First Amendment is not a liberal achievement, it's an Islamic achievement.
That's the most idolatrous thing I've ever heard. And
How is it idolatrous?
for idolatry to come from a Muslim is, I think,
I'm not Muslim.
both ironic but true. You are an idolater if you put America up to that kind of controlling factor over human history. That's American idolatry.
Well, I'm acknowledging your part in history and what the American Republic was all about. It was a rejection of Christianity and monarchy, and therefore the next stage of human political development must be the Islamic Republic.
That's ridiculous. Well,
But
okay,
there's a
we're
White
done.
House Quran.
We're done. We're done. I thought when I first saw your interview with the other guy that this is exactly where this would lead. You are a fascist Muslim and an Islamicist.
I'm actually an agnostic, but
Fascists are agnostic.
I don't see how the American civic architecture is full of fascist symbols. You're trying to end this conversation, oh dear. All right. Thank you, Dale. Thank you anyway. Right, I'll read the chat now.